I'm Cliff Ribner, and I want to talk to you today about slavery, the British Empire, America, and Marxism. They may seem like four different subjects, but they are very closely interrelated, because Marxism is it's collectivism. Karl Marx was basically a propagandist in favor of it, and he wrote the Communist Manifesto, which was published in 1848. And it wouldn't matter because it's absolute drivel, except it was adopted by so-called intellectuals as their Bible, first in Europe and then in America, ever since it's been published. It's really sickening trash, and in it, he demands that the world become communist. And what that means, he's very forthright. He has 10 demands. And the most important one is the abolition of all private property. That alone tells you how impossible it is for it to happen in real life, because nothing is more basic to human beings than having private property. And we know that for a fact from every infant. The first words out of an infant's mouth after it learns the words mommy and daddy is mine. Having property is the most important thing that everybody wants in their life. From the moment they're an infant, it's literally hardwired into us. And the abolition of private property is what Marxism is all about. He claims it's going to create a utopia, and we've seen what it does. This is not speculative. Every country that has had communism, it was a complete disaster. People had no freedom at all, and there was no goods and services available except for junk. And it's exactly the kind of goods and services you would expect if they're not being provided by people for profit, because profit is the engine that makes the world go round. And one of the wonderful things about what Karl Marx called capitalism, which is simply the free market, which he wanted to abolish everywhere, is that in every transaction where something is purchased and sold, both sides experience profit. That's what makes it work. And we know that because nobody has to enter into any of those transactions. Every sale transaction is one in which both sides agree. So that agreement is what Karl Marx wanted to abolish. And if it wasn't for the fact that intellectuals thought this was wonderful, we wouldn't even be talking about it. Anyway, he needed a target for his hatred, because Marxism has no intellectual content at all. It breaks down as soon as you start analyzing it. It falls apart. It's nuts. It's nuts based on real-world experience. It's nuts for a million reasons. The very fact that it considers profit to be evil, even though nothing would be there. There wouldn't be any goods and services for anybody if there wasn't any profit. And he literally thinks it's evil, because he has no concept of any power other than the power of force. He thinks everything has to be done by people being forced to do it, not by their agreement. And he doesn't want them to agree to anything. He wants everybody to be forced to do it. Anyway, he needed a target. And that target at that time in the 19th century was in particular the British Empire. America wasn't really much at the time. Although as time went by and we became the richest country in the world because of our free market and the lack of government intrusion into the economy, we became increasingly his target. So that when he died in 1870, by that point, we had become the main target. Britain had been the main target previously, then us. We inherited that. And it happens that America had this anomaly. We had slavery here until 1865. And if you listen to Marxists, people like Al Sharpton, he's a Marxist. He pretends that he cares about black people. He doesn't care about black people. He uses black people. Anyway, he sounds as if we still have slavery now, as if nothing has changed, even though a civil war was fought where 700,000 Americans died, making sure that we didn't have slavery anymore. And by the way, most of those soldiers on the side of the Confederacy, very few of them actually owned slaves. It was a tiny institution. Anyway, I want to put the slavery, and it happens that because he had had slavery, he accused America of being nothing but a slave state, which is absolute nonsense. And that, so that we had to, basically he accused us of making the black people slaves, and everyone else was a form of slave. He considered people working in factories also to be slaves, even though they were voluntarily there. It's all crazy stuff. And like I said, it wouldn't matter if it wasn't for the fact that intellectuals adopted him in 1848 and they started teaching this junk in schools, pushing it on the students, in fact. And anyway, at the time that he started in, the British Empire, basically, it comprised, in addition to England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, they had vast territories all over the world. So much larger. India alone. India was part of the British Empire, and India at that time wasn't what today's India is. It included what today would be the states of India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Afghanistan. I mean, it was huge. And yet it wanted to be part of the British Empire. It was not forced into it. And in fact, the way the British conquered the world, you could say, was with trade. And in fact, this is what how their empire was created. Anyway, I want to say a few words about slavery, since that's what this is about. Slavery is an institution that has existed in societies throughout history. They talk about it in the Bible. And the Romans, of course, had a very big system of slavery because their economy had two bases, agriculture and trade and manufacturing. Or not manufacturing in the sense that we think of it, but specialty goods, because they didn't have anything like mass production. The closest thing to mass production they had was agriculture. And it was on that. And what they would do is they would conquer territories, and the way people became slaves, where they were in the country that was conquered. They didn't enslave everybody. Only those that actively revolted against Rome. The ones who went along with it didn't have to be slaves. So slavery was also used partially as a method of including countries in the Roman Empire. The threat of slavery, if they fought the Romans, was a reason to be part of the Roman Empire. So slavery was always recognized as something that you wouldn't want to have happen to you. But by the way, they had it in Athens, the original democracy, and they had it in Sparta. And the Spartans had an entire, basically, tribe that they had conquered. And those were their slaves, the Helots. They did all their agricultural work, and they were their slaves. And in different places, slaves had different rights under certain circumstances. For example, in Rome, it was possible for slaves to buy their freedom. Some gladiators became big hit, and gladiators all started out as slaves. This wasn't something people did voluntarily. But when they could become big stars, like Hulk Hogan of the day, and they could make lots of money. I don't know exactly how they did it, but it happened. And it was not an infrequent thing that they could become quite wealthy even. And we have evidence, even in Pompeii, some of the wealthy homeowners there were former slaves who had managed to buy themselves into freedom and then create prosperous businesses, particularly baking. Baking was a very big business in Rome, and people could become very rich as successful bakers. Because obviously, if you were really good at it, people would want to buy your bread and your other things that you made. Anyway, and we have direct evidence of this in Pompeii. And what we know about Roman civilization. Anyway, the Romans had slavery. After Rome fell, there was a form of slavery which existed throughout Europe. And it existed really in various forms until the 18th century, depending on the country. And that was what's called serfdom. And the difference between a serf and a free man is that a serf could not own property, and a serf was not allowed to have freedom of contract. That's why the one freedom that's in the original Constitution, our Constitution, the one individual liberty that's in there before the Bill of Rights, the one they wanted to make absolutely sure was there, is freedom of contract. Because that's what separates free men from serfs. And that's the freedom that the Supreme Court has been stepping on for over 100 years. They've been pretending that clause isn't in the Constitution. And it is. It's very important. Anyway, as I said, slavery has had various forms. It's basically servitude. And even in America, the slaves had different circumstances. A lot depended on who owned you. But anyway, there's this notion that Marxists have promulgated that America basically initiated slavery, and the black slavery that existed here was the worst slavery in the world, and it was the most abominable, and basically we created the whole institution. That's a complete falsehood. Anyone who believes that is simply, they have misinformation. First of all, even among the Africans, and by the way, Africa was a trading partner with Europeans for hundreds of years, particularly beginning in the 16th century. And 90% of the trade from Africa, basically they didn't have a lot of goods that the Europeans wanted. It's very different from India and what we call Indonesia now. Those places had goods and services that Europeans wanted to buy and that traders wanted to have access to. Africa really just had one thing, and that was the fact that they had institutionalized slavery. And the way it happened was one black tribe in Africa would conquer another, and they'd turn all the people in the tribe that they beat into slaves. And this was a huge industry. Now, of the millions of slaves from Africa that were sold to Europeans and ended up in the Western Hemisphere, only a very tiny portion ended up in the United States, or what is now the United States. About 3% of them ended up here. 90% of them ended up in the Caribbean. And you have to understand slavery in the context of economics. It made no sense for people to pay, and what was a lot of money in those days for slaves, unless there was some economic purpose to doing it. And it happens that the economy of the Caribbean was actually much more important to the Europeans than our economy. You know, we think we were real important to the British. Nothing could, from a financial point of view, nothing could be further from the truth. We were a pain in the neck for them as far as they were concerned. The real money, as far as financial benefits to England from their empire, came from the Caribbean. And most of that came from growing sugar. And at that time, there was no way to mechanize the growing of sugar. It was a very difficult, hard labor job, and only slaves did it. Basically, no freedman would want to do it. But it was the most important thing in the British economy, basically after the 15th century. In fact, whenever the French fleet would start sailing towards Jamaica, Jamaica was the diamond in the crown of British colonial sugar trade. That's where most of it came from. The West Indies, but primarily Jamaica. Whenever the French fleet started sailing towards Jamaica, the British stock market would crash. That's how important it was. If the French fleet started sailing towards America, it didn't make any difference until, of course, they were sailing here because Washington had convinced them to come here after years of our revolution, and the gunboats were right off of Yorktown, and we won the war. That's when it really mattered to us. But as far as the British were concerned financially, the Caribbean was much more important to them. You have to understand how important sugar and coffee were. These were two very important things. And coffee didn't come from the Caribbean. But the development of coffee houses, beginning particularly in the 17th century, was a huge industry in the cities, and they liked their coffee very sweet. That's the combination of the sugar went to that, and to baking, of course, although that was a tiny part of it, but also to rum. Rum was a very popular liquor, and nothing was more important financially to the British, at least as far as this part of the world, than the growth of sugar in Jamaica. And 90% of the slaves from Africa went to the Caribbean, either for purposes of growing sugar, or they went to South America. The Spanish imported many slaves and the Portuguese in particular into Brazil. There was a huge slave trade there, but the importation of Africans into America was a tiny part of the whole slave trade. And what was unique about Britain and America when it comes to slavery, we were the only country since the dawn of time that made it illegal. In our Constitution, the slave trade itself was cut off. People claim that we were continuing slavery in all its forms when America was formed. That's not true. They knew at the time of the Revolution that they were going to have to end slavery at some point. It was completely anomalous to the entire Declaration of Independence. It's when you read the words of the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson, who of course owned slaves, it's like, how could this guy own slaves? And same thing with James Madison, who's the principal author of the Constitution. He also owned slaves. Benjamin Franklin owned slaves. He was in Philadelphia. It wasn't just a Southern thing. Anyway, they knew at the time that they were going to have to end it at some time, and they stopped the slave trade as of, I think it was 1812, in the Constitution. And the British were the first ones who completely abolished slavery in 1832. They simply made it illegal. This was completely new. And I want to also say something about India, because India is very important in the British Empire. They didn't just come in there and conquer it. What it is, India didn't think of itself as India. There was the British were the ones who named it India. It wasn't called that before then, except basically by Europeans. Or the Indians didn't think of themselves as Indians. There were many, many different kingdoms within India, and some of them were Muslim as of the 15th century. Most of the people in what is now India were Hindus. And many of the Hindus had these Muslim rulers. The Islam that was practiced by most of the Muslim rulers, at least the ones that were smart, was basically very tolerant. They didn't interfere with people's religion. They created problems for themselves when they became fanatics. Now, the original conquest in the 7th century, that was by fanatics who forced people to become Muslim or die. They weren't doing that by the 15th century for the most part. And to the extent that they did, they created problems for themselves. And the British came in there, and they weren't the only Europeans who came to India. The Portuguese and the French and the Dutch and the Danes had tried to establish footholds there, and they had some. But basically the Indians picked the British over all the Europeans as the ones who could actually make peace among the different kingdoms. So it was a voluntary thing. And what happened was in the 19th century, and the upper class and middle class Indians went to British schools. It was a very anglicized country. And they paid taxes to the British, but they enormously benefited from the trade. It was really a trading partner for England. That's what all of the empire was. It was trading partners, and that's all they wanted. In fact, India was not originally, quote unquote, conquered by the British Army at all. The East India Company, it was a corporation that was a trading company that established the British roots in India. And it wasn't until later that the British Crown got involved. Anyway, America was, the whole point of our revolution was to make us the freest people on the planet. And we were growing out of Our revolution grew out of the revolution that had been going on in England since the 13th century. It was the freest, or its people were the freest in the world, other than us, other than what we became. And our founders decided to take it even further. And that's what our Constitution does for us. We didn't have a king. We didn't have a parliament. We had a government that was defined and created in a constitution signed by the citizens and the states in a contract. And that is what has made us unique. And that's, even though we've had all these Marxist intrusions, all based on the lie that America is this terrible racist place. It's the opposite. It's the least racist place on the planet. But that has been the perennial Marxist lie about America, the smear, because Marxism is based on emotion and hatred. It has no intellectual content, and they had to have an object of hatred, and America was the object, or it became the object after the British Empire. And one of the things Marxists have always pretended to do is liberate. Like in Vietnam, the communists call themselves the National Liberation Front, and they always call themselves stuff like that. They claim they're liberating the people from colonialism. But the truth is, Vietnam, as a French colony, was so much freer than it became when it was no longer a colony, that the idea that they were liberating anybody from anything is nuts. And that's particularly true of the former British colonies. I'm Cliff Ribner, and if you like what I have to say, please like this video and watch my other videos and tell your friends about me. Thank you.